Hello and welcome to the rating room. My name is Jay.
And I'm Andy. Here on the Rating Room, we're going to be talking movies and TV shows.
This is our first season. We're going to be focusing on the James Bond franchise.
So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
The Rating Room. The Rating Room. The Rating Room. The Rating Room.
This is episode 5, You Only Live Twice. Andy, over to you.
Okay, so quick summary of the film. Bond is dispatched to Japan after American and Soviet spacecrafts even disappear. Each nation is blaming the other. We're in the midst of the Cold War here, so one side's blaming the other. Bond travels to a secret Japanese island to find the perpetrators and comes face to face with his arch enemy, Ernst Stavro Blofeld, the head of Spectre. So, Jay, what do you remember about the film before you rewatched it?
Yeah, I remember quite a bit. You know, when we had the Thunderball, I didn't remember much of that one. But this one, I did remember quite a few things. And I think this film, thinking back to my childhood, it must have been on quite a lot, you know, in terms of being on TV. So I remember that James Bond died in this film. I remember the volcano island in terms of the big base that Blofeld had. Also, Bond getting his surgery as well. He obviously gets married in this film as well. I remember the sumo wrestling as well. But also, I recall as well, this is the first time you actually see the full, on-screen appearance of Blofeld. And the submarine as well, I recall that quite clearly, you know, in terms of his funeral and him getting picked up in the sea and then coming on, and, you know, the bit about M being there as well. How about you, Andy? There's obviously a lot there that I recalled.
Yeah, you've picked up on quite a few things. I think I didn't remember quite so much. I remember the opening scene, which we'll get onto in a little bit, where it looks like one spaceship eats the other, kind of with the mouth of the ship opens and swallows the other spaceship rocket, I guess. I remember the death scene when Bond died in the fold-up bed. I thought that was quite a good scene, very memorable. I remember they got married, and I remember him, like you said, the surgery, him becoming Japanese. Very distasteful, I would say, in terms of racial sensitivities, but it's obviously integral to the plot of the film, but still a little bit uncomfortable to watch. I didn't remember the fact that Blofeld appeared, or the sumo wrestling, or any of the other stuff. That was about it for me. But clearly, you had a better memory of it than me. So let's go into a bit more detail about the film. So we've got a few villains in this one. Obviously, Blofeld, we've mentioned, is a recurring character in a lot of the Bond films. He's flanked by Mr. Osato and Helga Brandt as well, who are associates of Spectre. So we've got a number of Bond girls in this film. We've got Helga Brandt, who is a villain and a Bond girl, as was stated. We've got Kissy Suzuki, we've got Aki, and we've got Ling. And a little side note about Ling, the actress who plays Ling is also in a Daniel Craig Bond some 39 years later. She appears in Casino Royale, so a double appearance for the actress, and quite far apart as well. The theme song, as the name of the film suggests, the theme song is You Only Live Twice. This was sung by Nancy Sinatra. And in the opening credits, we've got all kinds of scenes around sort of Asian and Japanese influence. We've got silhouettes of Asian models and ladies, and volcanoes as well, which is integral to the film later on, as you will listen to. What else can you tell us, Jay?
Yeah, so You Only Live Twice has the highest Bond count so far, Andy, out of the 5 films that we've seen. I anticipate that going up higher, but it's 21 kills in this movie, so he's quite busy compared to the other films that we've covered so far. In terms of gadgets, obviously, you know, we are keeping an eye on the gadgets that he's using. So in this one, as it's been the theme with the last couple, it has kicked on in terms of gadgets. So we've got the mini rocket cigarette. We've got the waterproof body bag. We have the introduction of Little Nelly. We've also got the gyrojet rocket guns. And finally, the safe cracking machine that he uses when he's at Sato's chemical headquarters. Also, so we're also keeping track in terms of time it takes for Bond to say the iconic Bond, James Bond line. And he doesn't say it in this movie, Andy. So he hasn't said it in a couple of movies that we've had so far. So I know we've said this before. We thought this was something that he pretty much said in every film, but we've seen already he hasn't said it a number of times in terms of what we've covered. And we can kind of cover that again later on when we go through the ratings and rankings. So yeah, so you know, as we said in the previous podcast, we're also tracking, does he drink a martini? And if he does it explicitly say shaken, not stirred? And in this movie, Andy, he does drink a martini, but Henderson actually gives him the drink and it's stirred, not shaken. So, you know,
Interesting.
it is, yeah, a little kind of, I think it must have been an intentional nod to the audience, you know, in terms of the shaken, not stirred, but they kind of done a little in-joke there, I think, how they switched it around. And obviously Bond still drinks it. I think he says, oh, perfect, doesn't he, when he is actually is handed the drink from Henderson. How about, what other things are we tracking at the moment, Andy?
Yeah, so the hat throw and whether he's wearing a hat or not, and we've got a yes on both counts, so he's back in business on the hat front. Okay, let's talk about some favourite scenes. What was your favourite scene of the movie?
Yeah, this one, there was two that jumped out when I watched it. I thought, oh yeah, and then afterwards I was thinking, oh, just kind of recap. And the two that I thought was really good was the where he was escaping the docks. So, you know, where he's obviously at the docks with Aki, and then you've got the aerial shot where he's being chased by like the henchmen, but the camera, and you can see when he's kind of passing on the roof, different stages, you can see more of them kind of coming into shot, and then you see Bond kind of like fighting with a bit, and then it's progressing a bit more. I thought that was really good. But also I like the bit at the end where Tanaka, obviously Bond's at the volcano, and Kissy's gone to get some help, and Tanaka comes and he's at the top, and you think, oh, it's just Kissy and Tanaka, but then obviously then the ninjas appear, and then they start descending into battle, in terms of, you know, going through the hangar doors, you know, the sliding hangar doors there as well. I thought that was really good. Those are the two scenes that kind of jumped out to me. What about you, Andy, in terms of, what was your best scene?
So I had the same two scenes in mind, but as we'll get onto later, the second scene that you talked about annoyed me a little bit. But the rooftop scene, it was a bit cheesy, it was a bit hokey. It kind of reminded me of a video game, when especially the aerial shots where you just see these villains appearing from around the corner and Bond taking them down. It was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it, but it was silly. If you're looking for realism, that's not where to find it. But it was a fun scene, and I actually thought the aerial shot worked quite well, even though there was that video game hokey element to it. But it was a good scene. I enjoyed
I think that's a good point where you said about the video scene, because obviously when you play video games, when you progress in a level, obviously you get to certain checkpoints or points that then kind of initiate the villains to come on screen. And you're right there when they're doing the aerial shot, because you can kind of see him, can't you, lurking. And then as he's moving, they start slowly closing in at certain points. So yeah, that's a good point there.
So how many times did you reach for your phone whilst you were watching this?
0, but I nearly reached for it once. But I remembered that I reached for the phone once or twice in the last film, and it was the first time. So I was really disciplined this time, Andy. I was really, focused on the film. How about you? Were you well behaved?
Now, 4 or 5 times. As we'll talk about the ratings in a second, but it was just starting to get on my nerves. It was a bit boring. The film felt a bit flat, and I was distracted by my phone a few times. Quite a few times. I needed just a break from the screen for a second.
Yeah, and like you said, in terms of the rating, so listeners that have listened to the first few episodes will know each of these films are marked. We're giving them a score out of 10, and we're going to cover it later on as well, a bit more in depth. But I've given this one, Andy, 6 out of 10. How about you?
6 out of 10 as well, which I think for me is on par with Doctor No, the first film. But this one, yeah, it felt a bit flat, particularly after we've had some real highs with the Connery Bond so far, but this one felt a little bit flat to me.
Yeah, I agree. We can obviously go through the ratings and rankings later and talk about it a bit more in depth. So, next, the last bit before we start kind of getting into the film is the wife verdict. So, this one didn't go down well with the wife, Andy. I think we're probably going to touch on these kind of elements later on. There were a few times that the missus kind of huffed and puffed and muttered during this film. So in terms of once it was finished, I said, "Oh, you know what?" I made some notes as she was like muttering on in terms of the film. So she said it was very sexist, racist. Also, she didn't like that there were quite a few scenes. I don't know if you found it as well. I only noticed it because she kind of highlighted it where they were talking in say Japanese. I think it was Japanese and these particular bits, but there were no subtitles. And in some films there might be small pieces of dialogue where they don't put a subtitle on there. It's just an interaction between characters on screen. But this scene, like when the missus pointed it out, it did kind of highlight it to me in terms of there were longer scenes or longer pieces of dialogue that had no subtitles, so you can kind of interpret what they're talking about. But that is one of the things she did mention. But also, she said this was the movie that really showed Bond as a male chauvinistic, kind of like a male chauvinistic pig, really, and also very shallow, which I think it is. I think that there were underlying themes in the first 4 films that we've kind of covered in the episodes, but this is the one that really kind of highlighted a lot of things. I know obviously your missus isn't watching these, Andy, but what about those kind of comments? Can you relate to those kind of comments?
Yeah, absolutely. The sexism is almost a given with Bond. It's always been a tag that's been labelled against him, so that doesn't surprise me. Racist, yes, for sure. The old argument of it was a different time, I guess, comes into play here, but it's this day and age, it's completely unnecessary, some of the stuff that was going on in this film. And yeah, the chauvinistic and shallow side really came out. Bond's starting to show his true colours here. For a hero, he's got a few black marks in his book now.
Yeah, definitely. So that's the wife verdict. And yeah, I have to agree with both of you as well in terms of those points. So Andy, take us into some of our facts then.
Okay, so this was the 5th film in the series. 1 hour and 57 minutes was the runtime. Quite similar to what we've seen so far. We've not seen too much variation in runtime, so 1 hour 57 is about normal for this era of Bond. Released in 1967. This is the first time we've got a gap of a year. So the first 4 were released consecutive years between 62 and 65. Then we've got a gap through to 67 for this one, which is the first time we've seen that. But we will see that in future films, as we will discuss over the weeks ahead. And this was the first Bond film directed by Lewis Gilbert. He will direct 3 in total. He originally declined the offer to direct this, but he was convinced to take it on after a call from Cubby Broccoli himself. So obviously very persuasive is Mr. Broccoli in this case. Yeah, this is Lewis's first director of Bond. Yeah, let me say that in English. This is the first of 3 Bond films that Lewis directed. So interesting to see how this compares to the 2 we've got coming up in the future.
Yeah, so you obviously enjoyed filming if he comes back for a further 2 films. And it's a bit of a recurring theme, isn't it, Andy, in terms of the directors? And to be honest, it's not one of the things that we're tracking in terms of our ratings or rankings, or kind of like, the martini watch and the hat throw, is it, in terms of the directors? We are stating, as we do each episode, how many Bond films each director has done, but there is a recurring theme that the Bond directors do tend to come back, don't they, at some point during the series?
Yeah, and I think again another thing we're not particularly tracking too closely, but it's the same for some of the actors as well. We see either recurring parts, or we see multiple parts played by the same actor, particularly in these early days. So that's something we'll be discussing as we get through as well.
Yes. Okay, so yeah, thanks for that, Andy, in terms of some of the facts. So also, before we kind of get into the film, so like we usually do, we're not going to cover it scene by scene. We're going to talk about some general points, and then we're going to talk about some observations. So some of the general points we've kind of picked up on in terms of You Only Live Twice is that during the filming of this, Sean Connery actually announced that this was going to be his last Bond. So we had touched on this in terms of the promotional work in a previous episode, but Sean Connery has spent a lot of time obviously doing the filming and lots of the promotional work, and this was impacting on his ability to take other roles. So one of the things that the producers managed to do to convince Connery to stay on for You Only Live Twice was to give him a pay rise, because originally he signed on for a number of films, and obviously contractually his salary would have been stated and agreed in those contracts. But obviously they managed to give him a pay rise to keep him to do You Only Live Twice. So I thought that was an interesting point, Andy. Also, in terms of the promotional work, the cinemas stated in terms of the poster work that Sean Connery is James Bond. So they emphasized the is, and that's because the independent Casino Royale, not to be confused with obviously the Daniel Craig Casino Royale, was actually released 2 months earlier. So they were making a clear point that this is the actual official franchise for James Bond. So I thought that was interesting. I don't know, Andy, before going to the next couple points, if you have any kind of views on those two points I've kind of picked up on.
Yeah, interesting. I think quite smart of the company to promote Sean Connery as such. I think the Casino Royale film was it intended as a spoof? Was it intended as an homage? Certainly, they're trying to cash in on the success that Bond had so far, but the timing is very interesting in terms of how close they were released, and that's not going to be accidental, is it? So it almost feels like we have a bit of a Bond war going on, Bond versus Bond.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of my next 2 points as well, was that the first 4 Bond films are obviously very popular. We've discussed in the previous episodes, some of the box office returns that was seen for those films. But the first 4 Bond films are really popular in Japan, Andy. So Eon, who obviously produced these films, wanted to kind of take advantage in terms of like the Asian market by making this movie, because obviously, there's the book as well. And as we know, we've covered in previous episodes, they haven't filmed the movies in the order of the books. They've moved the order around. So I thought that was interesting. But also, as a lot of movies, as the years go by, the production costs increase. So I thought this was an interesting point. So obviously there's a gap between Thunderball and this one. And the production cost, so You Only Live Twice has the highest production costs, but only slightly in terms of Thunderball. So Thunderball was 9 million, and You Only Live Twice was $9.5 million. But actually, You Only Live Twice took 30 million less in terms of box office returns compared to Thunderball. So it was obviously a massive box office success. So in terms of the box office returns, it took in over $111 million compared to the budget, which was 9.5. So obviously, a massive profit there. But this is actually the first time in the series where the box office revenue declined, whereas, you know, the previous 4 movies had a year, a movie on movie increase in terms of revenue. But this is the first time they've seen a slight reduction. And it, you know, doing a bit of research for the podcast, it turns out that we've obviously mentioned about Casino Royale, which was a flop, but there was other spy movies being released around those times as well. So obviously James Bond came out, and other production studios saw how popular it was. So then they started to develop their own kind of stories. So the market kind of became a bit saturated at that point.
Yeah, saturation is the key point here. I think, you know, too much of a good thing means that everyone loses out, and this is a perfect example of that. I also wonder as well, based on our rankings and our rankings alone, whether the Thunderball movie being not quite as good as Goldfinger, arguably, you know, less, whilst commercially very successful, maybe artistically not as much, maybe that put people off going to see it to an extent. Just hypothesizing there, obviously cannot prove that, but it's certainly an interesting time period overall, like you said, with the saturation and the Bond versus Bond element. So speaking of the budget, you mentioned $9.5 million was the budget for the entire movie. $1 million of that went for building the volcano set.
This, I don't want to kind of go off topic here, but it is kind of related. I was watching a film with one of my kids the other day, and the film basically had a mansion being blown up, and they were saying like, but what, you know, is that a real house that they're blowing up? And when you think about it, they 5.7 million in today's money spent on a massive set. It's just crazy when you think about it, because obviously then they're not going to reuse that set again, are they? And it's just like, you know, build it and then take it down. But obviously, you know, and whereas nowadays, I suppose a lot of it is CGI, wouldn't they? I bet green screen or blue screen, some of these they could do as well.
Yeah, that's true. It seems quite frivolous in a way that you'd build something so elaborate and then, like you said, just tear it down, and then what, does it get put in storage? Does it get destroyed? Do you have to make a volcano movie as a result? All kinds of things to try and recoup some of that cost. Just kind of moving on to some other things about the film. So Queen Elizabeth II attended the premiere in Leicester Square. Queenie loves a good Bond film, like the rest of us, I guess. This was something that I didn't realise until we were doing the research, but the screenplay for this was written by Roald Dahl, obviously famous children's author. I wouldn't normally associate Roald Dahl with James Bond, so I was quite surprised to learn that. Yeah, so this was the first screenplay that Dahl actually completed, and he delivered a first draft within 6 weeks. He decided to do quite a similar plot to Dr. No, and obviously took inspiration from the spacewalks by the Soviet Union and the United States at the time. Bear in mind, this is 1967, so this is 2 years before the famous moon landing. So space travel was relatively new, obviously very big in the news around that time in the US and the Soviet Union. So Dahl took inspiration from that for his screenplay of this movie.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I think, yeah, in terms of Roald Dahl, I knew he did a Bond film just because my dad loves Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and Roald Dahl, and whenever that's on, my dad always says, "Oh, he wrote a James Bond film." So yeah, I can't remember which one it was, only as part of our preparation for this podcast. But yeah, it's interesting that he had a bit of a free rein in terms of doing the screenplay for this. Obviously, he's a successful writer anyway. So yeah, thank you for that. In terms of some other areas just to cover, I kind of touched on this actually at the beginning in terms of what I remember. So this is the first time we and Bond comes face to face with Blofeld in this movie, because obviously in the other ones that we've discussed, he only makes partial appearances, and as we've discussed as well, he's been played by different actors in real life. So yeah, so this is the first time that we see him in all his glory. And also originally on Her Majesty's Secret Service was intended to be the next film after Thunderball, and they were actually going to include a a plot twist that turned out that Blofeld was actually Goldfinger's twin brother, and he actually recruited an actor, I can't remember his name, and they did some scenes with him, but he just wasn't working. So they've obviously cut that out and went ahead with You Only Live Twice instead of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is obviously the next film. So what other points did you find, Andy?
So this was quite a fascinating one in terms of the production staff avoided disaster. So the group were due to return on a flight, but they cancelled their plans because they wanted to watch a ninja demonstration, which of which there's one in the film. And the flight they were originally booked crashed, and it killed everyone on board. So that would have been a very different story altogether. One of those miracles almost, where they, for some reason, they took the decision not to take the flight, and it was probably the best decision they ever made.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
Crazy stuff. Also, this film was pretty much entirely in one country, which is quite a deviation from Bond films we've seen so far, which are usually spread out across a variety of locations. And even the big budget of this film didn't really allow for much travel, I guess. So it was almost entirely in one country. And the final thing, just kind of linked to that, is this is the first Bond where 007 does not visit Britain at all. So there's no UK scenes, as it were, and we also, based on that, we also don't get MI6 headquarters, which is in Britain. So that's an interesting footnote.
Yeah, they really dived all in, didn't they, in terms of filming in Japan, and in terms of the ninja demonstration, and in terms of like some of the research that we've done, they visited a lot of places in Japan, filmed on location, like we said, for the majority of the movie as well. So yeah, they really went full in terms of filming over in Japan. Also, in terms of a couple of last points for me, Andy, before we kind of get into the opening scene. Kissy Suzuki was taken from the novel, but Aki and Helga were actually created as part of the screenplay, screenwriting process in terms of this movie. So that I thought that was quite interesting that they've used one of the characters from the novel, but obviously had to create two, because what we've seen in the first 4 films include, well, this one as well, the 5th film, is that there's always more than one Bond girl, isn't there? So there's always a bit of a formula in terms of one or two good Bond girls, and then you have like a bit of a villain Bond girl, which is obviously Helga that you mentioned earlier. And also another interesting point was that Kissy Suzuki, the actress, couldn't swim in real life. And also there was a number of other Japanese actresses that couldn't swim. And Sean Connery's then wife, Diane, actually filmed those swimming scenes for those actresses. I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't realize that until the research, but I guess that's one way to keep the cost down, isn't it? If you just hire one of your mates, or in this case, your wife. That's a good note. Let's get into the film in a bit more detail. So the opening scene, before we get to the titles, we've got a NASA spacecraft minding its own business in space, where all of a sudden an unidentified spaceship comes along and hijacks it. This is the scene I referred to earlier, where it looks like one is swallowing the other. And then we see talks being held between the Americans and the Russians, and UK is playing peacekeeper between the two. Bond is enjoying himself in a hotel room when all of a sudden he is killed. Rest in peace, James Bond. You will be missed. Quite a nifty scene where he's in a kind of a fold-up bed, where the bed folds into the wall, and then shots are fired and the body is found. And one of the I guess police that were investigating all come to find the body, quipped that at least he died on the job, which is a nice little nod to not only the fact that he's an agent, but also he was, in bed at the time. We don't need to explain that any further. I'm sure you understand what I'm getting at. And then that leads us into the opening title sequence.
Yeah, one of the things we've not documented Andy, but it was something on my mind. Was we've obviously highlighted that Sean Connery looks older than he actually is in one of the earlier podcasts. But for me, even though there was a year gap between Thunderball and this film, do you think he seems to have aged quite a bit more than the year gap? Because when me and the missus started watching that, if I didn't know there was only like 1 year gap between, as in like, 2 years, because there was like 1 year gap, it would seem to me that there was a larger gap than based on his appearance. I don't know what I felt that, in the first few, in the first 4 films, it was well toned. And I won't say youthful, because we both said we look younger than what he was in an earlier podcast, and we're older than he was at that point. But what did you notice that? Because I noticed that, like, when it first came on, I thought, oh, he's aged a bit already. And he's put on a bit more.
I completely agree.
Add-in. Yeah.
Completely agree. I thought if I didn't know how old he was based on the research, I would have said this is the film where he was starting to show his age. Whereas actually, he was starting to show an age of someone about 15 years older than him. Because at this time, 1967, he would have been, 36 years old? So even still younger than we both are right now. And yeah, he was looking like he was on his last legs almost. He's had a tough life as a secret agent. It's really taken it out of him. Kind of reminds me of the Twitter account with 80s footballers aging badly. Free plug there for whoever owns and runs that account. I've had a lot of fun with that over the last few days. But he was, you wouldn't guess he was mid to late 30s. You would guess probably pushing 50, I would say. Yeah,
and to be fair though, I'd still probably take his body over mine at the moment, even though it looks like 50s. He's still a better shape than me. But yeah,
it looks something. Older than we are, not necessarily older than we look.
So we've had the opening scene, as Andy just mentioned, and that, I think that was brilliant in terms of he's on the bed, and then the camera kind of focuses on the blood that's kind of coming through on the bed sheets, and then it's straight into the title sequence and music. So Andy obviously mentioned that Nancy Sinatra sang "You Only Live Twice," but it actually turned out that the producers approached her dad, Frank Sinatra, who declined to sing the title song for this movie, which obviously then opened up the opportunity for Nancy Sinatra to sing the title song. And similar to one of the previous films, I can't remember which one it is, Andy, because my memory's going now, I'm 40, but there's actually 2 versions of "You Only Live Twice" song. The one that's in the movie, in terms of the movie soundtrack, but which has the like the Asian influence at the beginning, when it kicks in, and you've got that little bit of Asian kind of music as well. The other version that Nancy Sinatra included on her records was minus those little bits as well. So there's actually 2 different versions of that one song. And I know as part of our research, Andy, we also found out a couple of other things, didn't we, in terms of the music?
Yeah, so there was a completely different title song recorded by Julie Rogers that was discarded. And another version of the theme song by Lorraine Chandler was discovered in the 90s. So various versions, or indeed completely different songs out there if you can find them. One final thing from me in terms of the opening credits. It must have been very cold when they were filming those, because there's a lot of very pointy nipples. Yes, I know it's childish, and I'm in my mid-30s and I should know better, but it was just nipples everywhere.
It did, when I saw those, it did remind me of Goldfinger, Pussy Galore's pilots, where that scene where they go to Goldfinger's stud farm, and Pussy Galore's pilots come off the planes, and they're all there, and the missus made a comment about the pointy bras, and that did remind me of Goldfinger. So we've had the title sequence and the movie sequence, and we go straight into the next scene, which is the submarine. And obviously Bond is dead now, so he's being buried at sea, and they push the body over into the sea, and as you see, there's two divers that pick up the body. This then obviously then goes on to the transport the body to the submarine. And the one thing I noticed, Andy, straight away was that the Navy men were wearing some very long, sexy white socks. So that's where my mind went straight away. I think there's about, was it 4 or 5 of them kind of carrying the body through the hatch of the submarine, and they were just wearing really long white socks with shorts. And that scene was actually filmed in winter. So apparently the actors were moaning that it was very cold where they were filming those in kind of like, I don't know if you say tropical locations, but it was actually winter when they filmed those ones.
Interesting point. So I think what our listeners have gathered now is that you're a leg man and I'm a breast man. But let's stay on point and let's talk more about the submarine. So M is in the office that he's got on the submarine. I thought this was very, very elaborate. You know, this is clearly a temporary office. He doesn't work permanently on the submarine. He's got the headquarters of MI6 where he's got his pretty snazzy office. But this was a very very fancy setup for something that's just a temporary solution, and I just wonder whether that is a bit of a waste of government money there. Should he just, surely he just needs a table and some pens and paper. What more can you need in 1967? But no, he needed all kinds of fancy furniture and pictures on the wall, and yeah, just a little thing that I noticed, that it was seemingly wasting government money. I wouldn't be happy if I was a taxpayer in 1967. That's for sure.
I agree. When I saw that, Andy, I thought the same in terms of he very much. There were no hot desk in there, was there? He very personalised the whole work area there, and definitely they didn't seem to have any efficiency savings that they needed to make at that time.
I bet about 51 weeks out of the year that room's just empty because no one dare move anything. So a complete waste. We also have Miss Moneypenny. She's on the submarine, so she's out on location for the first time. Her and James have their usual banter, dare we say, a little back and forth. Nothing too egregious or outrageous, just some nice friendly chatter that we've come to expect from the two of them. And then Bond is given a book of languages by Moneypenny. Says, he'll need that, and he throws it back to us and says that he doesn't need it because he took Oriental languages at Cambridge, which seems a very broad subject to take at one of the leading universities in the world. And I wonder exactly what that means.
Yes. So what do you reckon, Andy? And what is Oriental languages? Let's think. What would it be? So we think Chinese, Japanese. What other languages would we say? Because that's 2 complex languages straight away, I think.
I mean, that's going to be your 2 big ones, I would think. But I'm sure there are hundreds, if not thousands, of others that we're unaware of. So is Taiwanese the language? I think there's multiple languages spoken in China alone, probably multiple languages spoken in Japan as well. But just putting them all under this catch-all term is either it's a very, very wide-ranging course, or it's a little bit of laziness on behalf of the film writers because they didn't want to narrow it down to a specific country. So it's just in the general area.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So yeah, so we found out a bit more about what Bond did at Cambridge. Yeah, so Andy, obviously, you mentioned about Miss Moneypenny. I don't know if you've seen in the news in the last couple of weeks, but there's been kind of like some articles about having a Miss Moneypenny spin-off. So it wouldn't be a film necessarily, it would be a TV show, for example, in the James Bond universe, but it wouldn't necessarily feature James Bond, keep James Bond exclusively to the film, cinema, etc., but kind of focus on Miss Moneypenny in a TV series. What's your kind of thoughts on that? Would you like to kind of dig a bit deep in that character, or is that something you'd not be interested in?
On the surface, I would say it sounds like a good idea. Certainly commercially, you would think there'd be a lot of interest there. I do wonder, though, whether there's enough range in what she does, in terms of getting a whole series out of it. And also, obviously, if she is the central character, and from our experience so far, she's basically stuck behind a desk for the most part, is there much scope to go out in the field? Is she going to get heavily involved herself, or is it going to be a way to introduce other characters, other 00 agents, or more focus on M as well? So I'm a little bit torn. I think conceptually the idea is a solid one, but I wonder whether there's enough to make it work.
Yeah, I mean, when I saw it, I thought, we've obviously got things like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we've got DC, and in terms of like Marvel, you have the characters have obviously got their own TV show now because of Disney Plus, but you've got obviously these characters appearing in different films across that universe. So as a James Bond universe, I think it would be something that would be interesting, to see if we have spin-off TV shows. Might not be necessarily Moneypenny. It could be a TV show focusing on, like you touched on, 00 agents. Miss Moneypenny, because obviously in the first few films we've seen her as a secretary, but obviously in this one she's in the naval uniform, isn't she? So she's obviously got some kind of rank in terms of the Navy. So I don't know if it would be like an origin story that they could look at before she ended up with MI6, maybe. It's how, if they did it focus on her as in the present day, as in, it's alongside James Bond, but you don't see him, is how do you explain her doing missions when she's supposed to be secretary? So that's why I'm thinking maybe more an origin story would be interesting. But no, as a James Bond universe, it would be nice to obviously dig a bit deeper in terms of, because obviously we get the films every few years, don't we? And sometimes some of the films have quite a few years between them. So as a universe, it's something I would be interested in.
Yeah, I guess it's akin to Jason Bourne with the Treadstone series. I guess that would be the closest equivalent we've got. And also with Amazon Prime now holding the rights to MGM, or they've bought the MGM studio, so they've got the rights to the whole Bond franchise. Having an accompanying TV series fits their business model down to the ground. So commercially, I can see it being quite a viable option. I think creatively, I'm on the fence.
Yeah. So we kind of went off topic there. It's just one of those things I just thought about, and obviously, you mentioned Amazon have got the catalog, and it's something I have seen in the news over the last few weeks. So getting back to You Only Live Twice. So we're in Japan now, and Bond goes to see his first sumo wrestling match. Do you call it wrestling, or is it a fight? Sumo wrestling in the Bond series. One thing I did note was he basically turned up late, and then he left after the first one. So it's like, yeah, so he's really, he obviously only went to meet Aki and did, the I love you code phrase as well. But Andy, you have a greater knowledge in terms of Bond. This isn't the first time, is it, that we see a sumo match or a sumo wrestler, is it, in the Bond franchise? I recall, and I don't know which film it is, and I don't know if you know off the top of your head. I didn't research it, to be honest. I'm sure it's a Roger Moore film that there's a sumo wrestler. Do you remember what that is?
I recall the scene. I recall Roger Moore. I don't recall the movie.
Yeah, okay.
I think as we get into the Roger Moore era, they all kind of blend into one for me at times. And yes. I think this is one of those where I can't quite pick out which movie is which. But yeah, I'm dead set that there is more sumo wrestling later on in the franchise for sure.
Yeah, so if there's any listeners that know that, feel free to tweet us or contact us on any of our social media links, because I won't be looking that up, but feel free to let me know to save me looking that up. But yeah, thank you. So Andy, we're still in Japan. Anything else after the sumo wrestling match, in terms of where we are?
So he's with Aki, as you mentioned. Could have just met her outside. Didn't have to go to a sumo fight. It seems a bit of a waste. Could have just met in a pub or a restaurant or something. But never mind. So he's in the car. He's passenger. Aki's driving along. in her car, which is pretty well kitted out. When we'll talk about that as we go along. The car pulls up to the front of the hotel, and Bond is suddenly in the driver's side. So a bit of a continuity error there, or maybe they flipped the image accidentally, but Bond is clearly on the other side of the car. So a continuity error there. And this is where he goes to meet Henderson. Henderson played by Charles Gray. Remember that name for future reference. And there is an assassin that kills Henderson. He's wearing a face mask as well, so obviously very, very pre-COVID pandemic. Face mask, he's well ahead of the times there, so that was quite an interesting observation during these times that we live in, that face masks are now more and more prevalent, but back in 67, not so sure they would be. So that was a good one. So I mentioned Henderson obviously is killed. The scene where he's killed, I quite liked it. Although there is a bit where I thought I'd hit pause on the remote because he's talking away and then he stops. There's silence and it's still, and I'm thinking, oh, have I hit a button or something? But no, what happens is he's stood next to the wall, which is basically paper thin, as is traditional, and he gets stabbed in the back through the wall. So oblivious to, or James Bond is oblivious to that until such time where he stops talking and falls over dead. But I thought that was quite an inventive way to kill someone.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I was the same when Henderson died. I thought my DVD had basically froze. So then it kind of kicked in, and you obviously found out that he was stabbed in the back. I did wonder whether Bond was secretly thinking, why didn't that happen slightly earlier before I got my stirred martini instead of shaken? So he kind of actually got his proper drink. So he kind of missed that. But me and the missus was talking about this in terms of when Henderson died, he was so, like we both said, it was frozen. And I was saying to the missus, would that happen? Like if you stabbed someone in the back, you would kind of like stagger forward. You would be a bit vocal about it, but then she was saying, maybe the knife severed his spine, so he was kind of just like frozen. So I don't know if you had any thoughts of that. I just thought it was a bit of a not dodgy, but it was a bit of a funny death, a bit unrealistic. But then if you get stabbed in the back and it severed your spine, that might be a true representation of that. Death. But yeah, good point about Charles Gray appearing again, Andy. That was a good find. And in terms of the face mask as well, maybe they didn't have balaclavas in those days, so the simple face mask sufficed in terms of some kind of camouflage. But then we've got obviously the bit at Henderson's house, and then when it's a Sato's chemical building, we picked this up before. You can tell it's a stuntman in the fight scenes. It's just so obvious, isn't it, in the Bond franchise that, well, to be fair, it's obvious in the Sean Connery ones. I don't know if it's as obvious. We find that out in the coming weeks in terms of future Bond actors, but it was just so clear. But also, you and the missus picked this up as well, that they were basically just fighting and just picking up furniture, and they were just like using it as weapons. So how light was that? Obviously wasn't any kind of real wood there. They must have gone to IKEA or something there, because the furniture was just so lightweight. But yeah, you and the missus both picked up on that point, where they're just basically just picking up furniture and using that as weapons.
A weapon of choice, a sofa. I mean, who thinks to even pick up a sofa in the first place? But to know that it was as light as it was, that you can just pick it up underneath your arm, very, very bizarre. Speaking of the fight scene, so this is something that probably excites me more than it does you. But the henchman that he's fighting, I recognise straight away, and it's a guy by the name of Peter Maivia. Now, for those listeners who maybe don't recognise the name, or those that do and can't place it, Peter Maivia is a WWE Hall of Famer, very famous wrestler back in the day, and also a Samoan High Chief. His daughter married a wrestler by the name of Rocky Johnson. He was dead against that marriage as well. He wasn't having no daughter of his marry a wrestler because he knows what wrestlers are like. He's one himself. But Rocky Johnson and his daughter had a son who you might know a bit more these days as Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. So a little nod to my obsession / interest as a wrestling fan, and it was the one and only film that Peter Maivia appeared in. But he was a big star back in the days when this was filmed. So got the part because of his being a genuine badass.
That was a good spot, Andy, because obviously I don't watch WWE, so I didn't pick that up. So that was a good spot, and obviously linking it to The Rock as well. He was obviously a massive Hollywood actor now. So yeah, definitely a good spot there.
Followed in his granddad's footsteps. I mean, when The Rock, just going off a tangent, when The Rock first started out, he chose the name Rocky Maivia as homage to his dad Rocky Johnson and his granddad Peter Maivia, and that was his one of his first wrestler names was Rocky Maivia. And now to see him as a successful movie star is kind of like his come full circle there.
I wonder if we ever see The Rock in a James Bond film to kind of that link, because I can't see him being James Bond, but I could easily see him being a henchman. Has he ever played a baddie, The Rock? I don't know. I've seen obviously a lot of his films, but he always tends to play the good guy. Nothing jumps out.
He's more generally been in the hero role, hasn't he?
Yeah.
In the films. I mean, he's been a bad guy in wrestling, but that's by the by, and very entertaining one at that. So he's certainly got the acting chops to be a villain should he wish to be. But now I think you're right. I think he's more often than not, maybe always, been cast in the hero role.
I wonder if that's on his to-do list in terms. I know if it was me and you've got a relative that's appeared in something and you're in that field of work and you get the opportunity, that's definitely something I would be interested in. So it'd be interesting to see if that ever comes out that he has the opportunity to be in a future James Bond or something.
I'm pretty sure Oddjob, the actor who played Oddjob, was a pro wrestler at some point as well. And in a Daniel Craig film, we have Dave Bautista, who was a very successful wrestler, multiple-time world champion, and that's my little side project is wrestlers in Bond.
Yes, very good.
Monetize that somehow. Let's move on. So I mentioned Aki's car, and it started to bother me when she started using some of the equipment. So she's got cameras. Well, she's got not cameras, like TV screens in the car. So effectively like a CCTV system is what she's got. And there's a scene where they're being followed by a car, and then a helicopter comes along with a giant magnet. Very Top Gear, this is, I found. And the giant magnet comes down from the helicopter, picks the car up, drops it into the ocean. And all the while, Bond and Aki are watching this take place on the screens in her car. But the scenes that are being shown are the same ones that are being used in the film. So unless she has a film crew following her around at all times, this is just completely unrealistic. Like, where are the cameras that are beaming the images to the car? And does that mean she's just got another helicopter somewhere next to the helicopter that's got the car, and they're just filming? Do you see what I mean? It was just very, very bizarre.
I thought the same of you as you did, but I didn't I want to say I overthought it, but when it happened, I was thinking, because they're watching it on the TV, it has to explain how that camera was in the scene. Because if obviously, when they're over the water and it drops it down from the magnetic clampy fin, you can obviously, as a viewer, that's explained because it's just a camera, that you're seeing it. But the fact that they're seeing exactly the same, it has to be in the scene for them to see it. As an audience member, they don't need to explain how you can see that. But because they can see it, I thought exactly the same as you. So I thought that was just just unrealistic, because obviously this is before drones, and they haven't actually had Bond hasn't had a gadget drone yet. So you could say, oh, it was on the drone, but it was just silly. And also, what I noticed was, when Bond and Aki was being chased, the villains were shooting loads. I don't know if you picked that up with the machine guns. As soon as the helicopter came with a magnet, they just stopped shooting. So if I was in the car, I would just be shooting a helicopter that was trying to,
helicopter.
Whereas before they were just shooting at James Bond loads of times. As soon as helicopter came, that's it. You really like sticking your gun out straight away. Yeah. And just before we move on to the next bit, the other thing I noticed as well was that you can only see it a few times, because obviously the camera is moving between shots, and Aki's calling for Tanaka's help before the helicopter came. But the bits where the camera is behind Bond and Aki, and you can see the speedo bit in terms of the speed gauge on the car, it was always at 0. So obviously it was stationary, whereas obviously if it was actually moving, it would be going at whatever kilometers or miles per hour. But she's there pretending to steer, but the actual there's the speedo bit in terms of speed gauge was just constantly to the bottom left. It just never raised up. So is there anything, Andy, else that you want to cover before we kind of move on to the next part in terms of observations? That's everything that I've got so far. Is that the same with you?
Yeah, let's move on.
Okay,
we've
so
got some good scenes coming up.
Yeah, so we're transitioning now. There's obviously some other bits, but we've not we've sat. So they've left the chemical headquarters. They've had to chase, and now they're at the docks. And obviously, we both mentioned that this is one of our favourite scenes in the movie. But one of the things I commented to the missus was, after the chase, he's descending from the roof. So he tells Aki to go, and then he's descending. But instead of climbing downstairs, because there's gunfire, he has to kind of flip off and leap off of certain levels. And he's always landing on boxes that are covered. And it's just lucky that those boxes were really soft, or they actually had something in it, and he didn't just fall through a pile of empty boxes. So that was like the thing that I noticed straight away. And was there anything else in terms of what you saw when we're in the docks?
Yeah, so we'll talk about the fight scene in a second, but with regards to the boxes, why did he always have to do a perfect front flip as well and land on his back? Just a flat back bump would have been fine. It seemed a little bit showing off while he's got gunfire blazing all around him, but very good form, I must say. So the fight scene we mentioned earlier, he's on the roof, he's being chased by henchmen left, right, and centre, and then you see this area where the camera pulls back, and he's running along the rooftop. He's got a few henchmen behind him, and then you can see in front of him he's got maybe 20, 30 different henchmen all waiting behind different corners and at different areas of the roof. And he runs along, and there's a kick here, and there's a punch there, and there's a karate chop here, and down they go flying, and then they never get back up. Like he is either the deadliest striker that I've ever known, or these henchmen are really not good at taking a punch, but they're never heard from again.
Yeah, so one of the things, and this, I'm not having a go at anyone, but this is, if you were looking through a catalogue of henchmen, this would be the pound shop kind of level of henchmen, Andy, in terms of how they were going down really quickly, is what I thought.
Yeah, they were the worst of the worst, until the very end, of course, where Bond thinks he's high and dry, and then he gets bonked on the back of the head, and it's all over for him. He gets taken to Helga, which brings us on to the next point. So Helga has him tied to a chair. She's got him banged to rights. Then she lets him go. She has sex with him. And then he's flying her in a plane because he seems to have convinced her to join his side. But then she tries to kill him by strapping him down in the plane where he's not got access to the controls, while she jumps out with a parachute. And this is all over the place. Like, do you want him dead? Do you not want him dead? Are you on his side? Are you not on his side? If the plan is to just kill him, you've got him tied to a chair, kill him. This seems a very, very elaborate way to kill him. Unless, of course, you want to make it look like an accident, but that doesn't explain why she needed to have sex with him beforehand.
This frustrated me. So the bit about the helicopter that you said and the camera angle that got on your nerves. This was frustrating for me because I turned around and I said to like the missus, like, why? What is the whole point? Because if she's going to have sex with him, fair enough. That then there would have to be something that would trigger her to then kind of flip sides. But it didn't. It was just like a seamless, she's, like you said, he's tied up. She then like opens a case of torture instruments. Oh, so he's, you think he's going to get tortured. No, she cuts it and lets him go. Then, like you said, they have sex. And then she's gone to the trouble of getting an aeroplane, flying up to how many thousands of feet in the sky, to then press a button which this board comes out to restrict Bond, to then parachute out for then him to die in the sky. It just, it just frustrated me, this did. It just really frustrated me.
Ludicrous.
Yeah, it is ludicrous. And I think, she gets what she deserves, doesn't it? In terms of being eaten, I'm going to talk about this next point. So I'm just going to skip ahead, but she gets what she deserves in terms of the piranhas, which obviously Blofeld doesn't know that she's done a bit of hanky-panky with James Bond. So in terms of this next point, Blofeld tells, Helga and Asata that they've let Bond go. How, had they had Bond, they let him get away. But then the woman, Helga says, but Bond is dead. It was all over the papers. But then at the beginning, when we saw that Bond was dead, it included a photo of Bond on the papers. So she's saying, oh, yeah, it's in the papers, therefore seeing the photo. But she's just met Bond, and he wasn't even transformed into a Japanese fisherman yet. And she's had sex with him, but she didn't recognize him. It just didn't add up. Any of that just didn't add up at all. So she definitely got, I don't know how. Did you say she's number 11? I can't remember. I don't know how she's got to number 11 in Spectra. That is just frustrating, that is. Is there anything you want to add to that, Andy, before I get on to Q?
Yeah, no, I know to the point as well. It was, like you said, he's not disguised. It's not a secret that he's dead. Everyone knows what he looks like because he's on the front of national and international newspapers, which in itself is quite strange, because if he is a spy, which he is, why would you want to publicize the fact that one of your spies are dead? You might as well have like the start of season roll call and have, here are all the spies that we've got in play for the year ahead. It's like, yeah, all kinds of things wrong with this.
Yeah, so yeah, that's frustrating. So so we've had that bit. He obviously survives. And then we see a bit later on Q. So again, Q is back out on location. We said before that he's come out back on location. I think it was in Thunderball. In the previous episode, we said that. But again, there's a bit of banter between Bond and Q that we've seen in the that we covered in previous episodes. And he makes a little quip, a remark that Q is Nellie's father. So I thought that was funny. And then I quite liked the bit as well. And obviously, this was filmed in the 60s, so there was limitations in terms of technology. But I quite like the bit where it comes in a number of suitcases, and then on camera, you see them building it, like in terms of snapshots, kind of like, and I quite enjoyed that bit in terms of them building Little Nelly. It kind of reminded me of like playing with Lego, building Lego. In terms of, Little Nelly. So I quite like that bit, Andy.
Yeah, Meccano,
yes.
to mind of.
Yes.
Yeah,
Meccano.
yeah. But yeah, the like the snapshot thing, like you said, is just kind of almost like an instruction manual. Here's how to build Little Nelly in 6 easy steps. Yeah. And it gives you the little pictures. Yeah, it's pretty good. So let's move on. So we're getting to the point now where Bond needs to become Japanese. He's gonna take on this new persona as a local Japanese fisherman, and then there's a bunch of nurses there to help with the procedure, all in bikinis and lingerie. Not sure if that is medical uniform or of normal practice. Maybe he's gone private and sends the uniforms, but it's certainly interesting attire for medical procedures that are about to happen. That's for sure.
Can I just add, Andy? I obviously, you know this, but I work in a hospital, and I can confirm that is not normal work attire, underwear and lingerie.
So let's talk about the procedure itself. Obviously, they need to change his hair, they change his eyes. There's mention, I think, earlier in the film of Japanese men not having hairy chests, and Bond has got a very thick, black, matted, hairy chest. But no attempt to shave or wax or even slightly trim. So he's not really taking this seriously, is he? You know, he's got some new hair, and he's got some fake eyebrows and fake eyelids, but from the neck down, no attempt at all to become Japanese. I don't think he's really bought into this.
I agree. I think this whole subplot was, I don't know, it's obviously insensitive, and, you know, looking back at it now, but I'm just trying to think, you know, live, how else they could have done it. Do you know what I mean? In terms of, obviously, he was supposed to be playing a local fisherman, but you could have just explained that, oh, this is my husband, and he's American or English, and he's living with me, or something, you know, just, or couldn't he be smuggled on the island and then just basically work covertly, you know, to keep in the shadows? Why did they have to do the whole marriage and the whole operation? It just frustrates me. Some of this film does.
It's a long-term procedure for a short-term mission. You know, if he's going to have to assimilate to life and spend years and years on an island, or you know, get entrenched into Spectre and become an agent himself, or whatever, you know, whatever elaborate plot you can think of, then you can kind of see, well, okay, we need to go to a bit of trouble here, but this seems overkill. And, you know, there are other ways to do it. Maybe just grow a beard, put some sunglasses on, you know, wear a long coat.
Yeah.
But medical procedures and becoming Japanese, and like you said, there are racial sensitivities around it. Very strange, very unnecessary. Doesn't stand up well, I don't think, this particular element.
No, definitely not.
Final thing from me before I let you take over is Aki, when she was killed. It's quite a clever assassination, although completely accidental. With the assassin comes in, he climbs to a space above her and Bond in bed, and he's lowering down poison on a thread. He's got it perfectly lined up to Bond's mouth, so he ingests the poison, when all of a sudden he rolls over slightly, and she rolls over to greet him, or kind of, you know, snuggle to him or whatever, and lo and behold, she ingests the poison and dies pretty instantly. Quite an interesting way of doing it, I thought.
Yeah, I agree. I thought it was clever. Also, I thought I was a bit sad for Aki dying, because did she outwit Bond earlier? You know, with the bit in the tunnel where she's being chased, and the flooring, you know, went down, and Bond obviously then slid into Tanaka's lair. She obviously came to save Bond earlier, you know, when he was being just about to be gunned down outside of Asata's chemical works. So I was a bit sad to see her die. So yeah, and then obviously then he goes off, doesn't he, and gets married. That's pretty much in the next few scenes. So this next bit, so the missus was quite vocal about this bit, because I just took it. I did. So when Bond and Tanaka together, they're lined up, and these would-be brides are being brought out, and the missus was just like, Oh my God, did you see that Bond's face? He's so shallow and vain because they're like, he just has this look of, I don't know if you say disgust, but like disappointment, you know, when the first couple of potential brides comes out and she was just having a bit of a rant about it. So, like I said in the wife verdict at the beginning, she was quite vocal about it, whereas I just kind of rolled with it and just, you know, that's to be expected with James Bond, really.
Yeah, it's a little bit underhand, isn't it? I think as well it brought back to mind what happened just a few minutes earlier, where they were talking about the idea of getting married, and I think Bond asks Tanaka, "Is she much to look at, or is she good looking?" Whatever the words were said, and Tanaka, I'm assuming he was joking, basically said, "Oh no, she's got a face like a pig," and maybe this is what brings on his look of like disappointment when these women are coming up the stairs to the marriage. But none of them were pig-like in any way. They were, you know, some were slightly older women and some more attractive than others. But I mean, come on, James, you know, play the part.
And he's on a mission. It doesn't really care what she looks like. And then so obviously then we're introduced to Kissy Suzuki, and one of the things, and I know we've mentioned this in previous episodes, and it's just the time that, isn't it, that this was filmed. It was just so evident that when they go fishing, it's just a fake background in terms of the sea and island as well. And I don't know if you picked up on this, Andy, but again, the missus was very vocal about this, that basically from now on, Kissy Suzuki is pretty much wearing a bikini in every scene, whereas Bond is wearing like a kind of like a shirt or shorts. There's some bits where, you know, he is like, you know, dressed. You know, he does, you know, have a like, you know, you could see like he takes his shirt off or something like that. But she's just constantly in a bikini for the pretty much the majority of the movie. And then there's another bit before you kind of feed in a continuity mistake where the missus picked this up as well, where so Bond and Kissy jump into the ocean, you know, where they go to the cave, so they basically veer off from the other fishermen and they go to the cave, and obviously there's a poisonous gas, so they jump into the water. You can see Bond's skin basically through his wet shirt. So they then obviously come ashore onto Blofeld's volcano island. And then they obviously make that journey up to the top of the rim of the volcano. And then they start descending. When he realizes it's like a metal hanging door instead of like water, he then starts whipping out like these suction cups and this grey outfit underneath, and he's like, where did that come from? He wasn't even carrying a backpack or anything. He just like, I don't know, you know, if you noticed that, but like the missus picked up straight away, like, where's those suction cups come from? Like, you weren't carrying a bag. So that's just like a continuity mistake there.
I dread to think where he was hiding those. I mean, like you said, he's clearly not wearing them underneath his clothing, and Kissy's not wearing any clothing of note to hide anything underneath anyway. Unless they're just, you know, it's just these things that they have lying around at the top of volcanoes just on the off chance. But yeah, very, very, very bizarre. We get into the volcano now. It's all kicking off, and Blofeld's got his cat, although he's struggling to keep hold of the cat, and maybe the cat shouldn't be involved in these kind of fight scenes, to be honest, because clearly quite terrified. And I don't know if it was meant for the cat to jump down or, you know, be scared, but clearly he was having a hard time keeping hold of it. Another thing, not about Blofeld, but more just baddies in general, and particularly noticeable in this, is they all seem to like old artwork. It's that kind of a baddie 101, you know, dummy's guide to how to be a baddie. You know, step 1, buy some artwork. Step 2, renovate a volcano. You know, those kind of things. Very, very bizarre, but they always seem to like their artwork.
Yeah, and you obviously mentioned this, Andy, earlier. I just thought about it actually. where, you know, megalomaniacs or villains always tend to have some kind of artwork in there, and it's always kind of old artwork, isn't it? But you obviously mentioned about M having his submarine done up, so maybe it's people in positions of power that just like to express themselves or show off what their art collection.
You might have a point there. Maybe the M stands for megalomaniac. I know that's
Maybe.
not correct, but you know, I'm sure someone will correct me on Twitter for later on. But for the purpose of this, that's what the M stands for from now on. We're getting close to the business end now of this film. So we're at the volcano. The ninjas appear that Tanaka had been training down at his ninja school, and they're all rappelling into the volcano via the sort of the hangar door that, you know, covers the top of the volcano. This scene bothered me, and I briefly touched on this earlier, but this bothered me because they're all coming from the outside and they need to kind of rappel into the facility, but all the ropes are already tied to the underside of the roof. So that means they must have got in to tie their ropes to the underside, as opposed to tying them somewhere on the outside and then lowering in. And also, they didn't all just come down at once. There were like waves of ninjas coming down for several minutes. It wasn't just like, you know, 2 or 3. It was quite a significant time period. There were ninjas still coming down, still coming down, still coming down, even after the roof had been closed. So I just wonder how that happened. Did they all come at once, but then a load of them stayed behind, or did they somehow get another means of entry after the roof was closed? It didn't make sense that we know the roof's closed, we know the ninjas are there, but yeah, here's some more ninjas, and here's some more ninjas. Really kind of put a downer on that particular scene for me.
It's interesting. The first thought that comes to mind is you touched upon video games earlier. They probably just respawned, Andy. You know, like in video games, when you die, they just respawn. So they've probably got a checkpoint, a respawn point above. But yeah, this was, like I said earlier, one of my favorite scenes. But yeah, I get your point in terms of how they were descending into the, you know, volcano's lair. But yeah, no, that is a valid point.
Yeah, other than that, I think it was a pretty good scene. There was, you know, the usual kind of fighting went off, and then Blofeld, I believe, blows up the volcano. So we get the explosion and we get the lava coming out. And we've talked about use of special effects and green screen and things of that nature. I thought this particular scene, and you know, it put a little bit more of a downer on the film because it's so vital to the overall story, and it's right at the end of the film. The use of special effects here, I thought, were really, really bad. Like, probably the worst I've seen in any of the Bond films we've seen so far. Like, it just wasn't even remotely realistic. I don't know what you thought about that.
I noticed it, and I thought it was, obviously, you know, in terms of the intro sequence, you had the volcano and you had the lava in the intro sequence. I agree, and we'll obviously talk about opening credits rankings later. But I thought it was poor. I'm just trying to think whether it was the worst special effects in it. I'm thinking about early blood, you know, the really bright blood that we're in Doctor Now. We've had some fast scenes as well, you know, unneeded fast scenes, which do you recall any fast scenes in this? I didn't notice it, actually, because we've commented in the last 2 films, haven't we, that there were fast scenes, but I like sped up scenes. I don't recall anything from this one when watching it through.
Nothing stood out. And I have been looking out for those kind of things just because they were so noticeable in the last 2 films.
Yeah.
Nothing of that nature this time round.
Yeah. Is there anything else, Andy, in terms of the film?
Yeah, I guess the final part, obviously, Bond, Kissy, Tanaka, and the ninjas escape. It looks like they escaped down the same route that had the poisonous gas, which is either a continuity error or I've mistaken, or there's a mistake somewhere, but it very much looked like the same route.
I thought it looked the same route as well, and I thought, oh, what happened to the poisonous gas? And I said to the missus then, I was like, oh, Have they just come out the same way? Because if they have, you saw that bit, didn't you, where they were swimming? It looked like basically at the beginning of some kind of what they call it in the events where you do like swimming, cycling, and running.
The triathlon.
Yeah. So it looked like, at the beginning, there's just load of basically swimmers. You just see heads. When they're escaping at the end, it did the camera shot was behind the swimmers, and it just looked like it was like the beginning of a race. And I thought it was the same route that they took earlier. So yeah, I wonder if it is a continuity error or it just happened to have multiple escapes from this secret lair. So it can't have been that secure. So I think that's it, isn't it? And in terms of our observations before we kind of move on to the one-liners, is there anything else that we're...
The one thing I didn't write down, and I guess this is a given at this point, the film ends with Bond and Kissy shagging in the boat.
Which is just a recurring thing in terms of how Bond films end. He's always waiting to be rescued. I would love it because when that happened, in terms of them escaping, I don't know if it's a Navy or the Japanese Secret Service or whoever basically dropped the inflatable boats, haven't they, at the end? And I was thinking, I'd love to be one of the ninjas that just basically went on the same boat of them just to make it awkward. Because if you notice, like you're seeing 5 or 6 men basically go into one boat, and then you just see Bond and Kissy just go on the boat on their own. I'd love to be kind of like the third, what is it? What's the saying?
That third wheel.
Yeah, the third wheel on that. Yeah.
But it raises a good point though, because if these boats can fit 5 or 6 people, which it clearly could, if they just sent enough boats for the amount of ninjas that survived, does that mean there's 3 or 4 still floating out in the sea because they had nowhere to go?
It kind of reminds me of what happened to Leonardo DiCaprio in Titanic, where he basically just didn't have a boat because he would just is it Rose? What's her name? Is it Rose in Titanic? Kate Winslet character.
Yeah, Kate Winslet. She has that door all to herself.
Yeah,
plenty of room on that door, love. Come on.
Yeah, so that's that in terms of observation. So as we do for each of the episodes and movies, we kind of pick out some of our one-liners or kind of quotes, interactions between some of the characters. So Andy, I'm going to go first. So we kind of touched on this earlier, actually, as one of your points. So this is between Bond and Tanaka. So Tiger Tanaka says, "You know what it is about you that fascinates them, don't you? It's the hair on your chest. Japanese men all have beautiful bare skin." And then Bond replies, "Japanese proverb says, bird never makes nest in bare tree." So that's kind of like one of the ones I picked out, Andy. What about you?
So there's the scene where Blofeld introduces himself to Bond. "James Bond, allow me to introduce myself. I am Ernst Stavro Blofeld. They told me you were assassinated in Hong Kong." Bond replies, "Yes, this is my second life." To which Blofeld replies, "You only live twice, Mr. Bond."
Yeah, I like that because obviously it ties into the title of the film. So that is a good quote. This one, I'm just having a little laugh because when this happened, the missus again was having a little mini rant about this one, and I did think, I don't think you could say that now. And so this is between, maybe I shouldn't be laughing, I'm being insensitive, but the interaction is between Bond and Ling, which is obviously at the beginning, just before he gets gunned down in the folding bed. So Bond says, "Why do Chinese girls taste different from all other girls?" And then Ling goes, "You think we better, huh?" And then Bond says, "No, just different. Like Peking duck is different from Russian caviar, but I love them both." And then Ling is like walking and she says, "Darling, I give you very best duck." And it just made me laugh when it happened. But yeah, the missus was having a little rant about being sexist and racist and chauvinist. Big he was. She wasn't keen on Bond in this one. Even though at the beginning I said this was, she did say this was one of the better films, but generally not necessarily about James Bond. And so that's the last quote or one-liners that I got, Andy. Do you want to finish us off? Because there's a couple more that you want to kind of cover.
Yeah, there's a part in the, I think it's at the where Bond gets down the tunnel and he meets Tanaka for the first time. And Tanaka says, "It can save your life, this cigarette." And Bond responds, "You sound like a commercial," which I thought was quite, a nice little quip. And the kind of the play on, cigarettes obviously being bad for you, but can save your life. And then the final one is when Bond and Moneypenny are having their brief interaction on the submarine. Moneypenny says, "Oh, by the way, how was the girl?" And Bond replies, "Which girl?" "The one we set you up with in Hong Kong." "Well, 5 more minutes and I would have found out." Which, is clearly obvious what he's implying there.
Yes. So obviously, yeah, that's the bit at the beginning before, like you said, he's gone down. So another thing that we're doing, and obviously, Andy, we can only do this for so many movies because we've still got a lot of movies to do this. But this little kind of feature is the differences. We're not going to go into detail. We're just going to pick out some differences between the book and the movie. And as Andy mentioned at the beginning, the book and the movie are very different. They've only basically, we said about Rodal basically having a clean slate, and he basically wrote. He only kept certain elements of the book. So, in terms of the book, this is actually the final appearance that we see of Blofeld in the novels. Whereas, obviously, in the film, and I mentioned this earlier, they changed the ordering. So this is the first time we actually see Blofeld full on-screen appearance. But obviously, in the book, this is the last time that we saw him. Also, in the book, so this is obviously, because it's a series in terms of the books and the films, to be honest as well. They carry on. So in terms of the book, on Her Majesty's Secret Service, was the book before this one. So Blofeld obviously kills Bond's wife in Her Majesty's Secret Service. So in the book, Blofeld has fled Europe and gone to Japan, and he's obviously got that volcano hideaway now. And so that's obviously a big difference in terms of the book and the movie. And also in the book, Bond is actually injured and he develops amnesia. And he basically ends up briefly living, as we do in the film, as the husband of Kissy, Suzuki. But he's actually captured by the KGB, who end up brainwashing him. And then that leads on to the next novel, which is obviously the man, in terms of the book, is The Man with the Golden Gun. So I thought that was some interesting points. It was a bit harder, this feature, because obviously, as we know at the beginning, they changed so much of it. So there's so many differences. Andy, is there anything you want to touch on in terms of those kind of things that we covered in terms of book versus movie before we move on to the big feature, which is the quiz?
Yeah, can I add one point in here? Because as I was doing some research, and I didn't note this down because this was quite a late thing that I found out, but did you know that in the books, James Bond and Kissy Suzuki have a son?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, they have a son together. James Suzuki is his name, and the Only Live Twice novel is the first time this character appears, although I believe he's unnamed at this point, but he does appear in future books. And he is the son of Bond. And I had no idea that was even considered in the novels. I've not read the novels. I've read some of the short stories, but I've not read any of the novels. But yeah, James Bond has a son in the books.
That's interesting, and I'm going to have to do a bit of research, because obviously he doesn't have a son in the film, as you know, as you just highlighted, in terms of the difference. And I wonder, because I've read some books, but not many, and I don't recall the son appearing in those books. But like I said, I think I've only read 2 or 3. And then I've read some that were set when Pierce Brosnan was the Bond, so at that time as well. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see whether he does make appearances, or how much of an input in terms of the stories in the novel, or if it's just basically, in the background. Does he live with the mum? Is he, Bond's obviously in England, Kissy Suzuki and the son is in Japan. I don't know. We're going to have to, I think, dig a bit deeper in that one, Andy. I think.
I'm thinking I need to
bit of homework for
someone
you
to buy me the books for like a future birthday or Christmas present or something.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, so thank you, Andy, for that. So the quiz, so let me just pull up the quiz. So as people, listeners have been listening to the other 4 episodes, will know about this. So this is the kind of like the segment where I will give Andy 4 statements, and Andy will identify what 2 statements are correct. So from memory, Andy, because I am, my memory's getting worse as I get older, you have got every week right except for 1. Is that right?
That sounds about right. I remember I was on a roll, and then you decided to change the rules because you didn't like my constant success.
Yes.
And then I think that's when I got 1 out of 2, and then I'm back to winning ways.
Yes, I think that was Goldfinger. Yeah, so the first 2, there was 1 statement that was right, and then I mixed it up for Goldfinger, where I doubled that to make it 2 statements, and then you got them right last week on Thunderball. So so this is the 5th one, and if I'm being honest,
you say mixed it up, I say fixed.
Like I said, by adding an extra statement that is correct, I'm basically giving you now a 50-50 chance. Surely that's making it easier.
Or are you making it doubly hard because I've got 2 to find rather than 1?
I suppose
listeners can decide. They know where to send their hate tweets. Use the hashtag #JScrewedAndy.
Okay. And if I'm being honest, Andy, I'm struggling to think of these now. I'm going to have a question in every James Bond episode that we do. So I'm going to do it for all 25 films. I'm just struggling to think of fake answers, if I'm honest. Even on episode 25, on number 5, episode 5, and I've got 20 more to go. So I need to be a bit creative. So I'm going to say all 4, and like I said, each week I'll let you either just pick them or let me go through all. I'm happy, to take your lead. So the first statement, is this correct or incorrect? This marks the final on-screen appearance between Sean Connery and Lois Maxwell, who plays Miss Moneypenny. So would you like me to go to statement number 2?
Let's go statement 2, yeah.
Okay. The volcano set had to be partially rebuilt as the sliding hangar doors kept getting stuck during the final fight scenes.
Okay.
The third statement. Nancy Sinatra was the first non-British singer to perform the theme song for James Bond. And the last statement, and the running theme in these statements, my granddad was in the crowd during the sumo wrestling fight in Tokyo. So just to recap, 2 of those are correct and 2 of those are wrong. Do you want me to repeat any of them, Andy?
No, I think I've got them straight away. Your granddad is a liar.
Oh, yes.
He's got a lot to answer for as Granddad Laws, because he keeps coming up with these stories that he's telling you every week, and they're never true.
I don't know if I told you this. I can't remember if I told you this or not. He was in the Navy, just so you know. Okay. So he has traveled around the world. And I can't remember. It's not so much like an Uncle Albert from Only Fools and Horses, but he has told me some stories. And I can't remember if he ever went to Japan or not. But yes, that is right, that it is incorrect.
So that's definitely incorrect. Now the first one.
Okay, so
the last meeting between Sean Connery and Lois Maxwell.
This marks, so the statement was, this marks the final on-screen appearance between Sean Connery, who's obviously James Bond, and Lois Maxwell, who plays Miss Moneypenny.
So we know that Connery is going to come back for another Bond film in 71. We know that Lois Maxwell is in quite a lot of Bond films, possibly all of them to a point later on. And there's also, I don't know if this counts or not, but I believe she was in. Was she in Never Say Never Again, which I know is not an official Bond? I'm not sure if she reprised. Maybe no. So maybe she didn't reprise the role there. So I'm going to say that they are in the next one that Connery does together, which is Diamonds Are Forever. So therefore, that statement is also false.
Okay. So that would leave the volcano set being partially rebuilt because the sliding hangar doors were getting stuck during the fight
I can
scenes.
believe that, yeah.
And Nancy Sinatra was the first non-British singer to perform the theme song for James Bond because she's American. Andy, that is incorrect. So
darn it.
So this does actually mark the final on-screen appearance between Sean Connery and Lois Maxwell. So in Diamonds Are Forever, well done for saying the year 1971. You don't get any bonus points though. So well done, but pat on the back, but no bonus points. The scene that they filmed, they didn't actually film it together. They have to film it separately. So Sean Connery filmed his lines separately, and then they did the Lois Maxwell scenes. So they weren't actually on screen together. So this is actually the final on-screen appearance in terms of the official James Bond films. Like you said, I'm not too sure if they're in Never Say Never Again, but yeah, in terms of the canon, this is actually the final on-screen appearance. So that means the volcano one is incorrect. It wasn't partially rebuilt because sliding doors. So were you confident on Nancy Sinatra? Because I obviously we've had 4 songs, but the first one was just the music, wasn't it, that we've covered in episode 1, and then we had Matt Monroe and Tom Jones, not Tom Jones, Shirley Bassey, then Tom Jones.
Matt Monroe is the one that I was not sure about.
When I was researching this to come up with the 4 questions, I'm thinking, Tom Jones is easy, Shirley Bassey's easy, and then I'm thinking, obviously the first one's just the music, and I'm thinking, it's Matt Monroe. Would he think that is English? And he is British, sorry. So Nancy Sinatra is the first non-British singer. So well done for getting my granddad was not in Tokyo during this, so well done for that. And I think when we watch Diamonds Are Forever, we can obviously see that scene, can't we? And see if it's obvious or not that it was done separately. Must have been clever camera angles to make it look like, because apparently, from this research, what happens is Miss Moneypenny gives Bond his travel documents, but it wasn't actually filmed together. So they must have done it, obviously, different camera angles.
She probably emailed him.
Yes, if only they had emails, then it'd be so much more impersonal. They wouldn't be able to flirt, no, would they? They wouldn't be able to do their little flirting.
It'd just be sending emojis like of the peach and the aubergine.
Evie always in trouble with HR, wouldn't he, Bond?
Can you imagine him going in HR and reading out some of those text messages he's been sending Moneypenny? Would not like to be in that meeting, that's for sure.
Okay, so our next part. So let me just bring up, listeners, just ignore this bit. I'm just going to share the screen with Andy, and we're just going to go through our rankings now. So we do this each episode. So we touched on these first few bits already at the beginning. So Andy, as you said, You Only Live Twice is kind of like you said, they're always around the same, but it actually comes in at number 2 in terms of runtime. So the last film that we watched was the first film, as we mentioned in the last episode, that breaks the 2-hour mark. So as Andy mentioned earlier, this one clocks in at 1 hour 57 minutes. As I mentioned earlier as well at the beginning, this does have the highest kill count. So James Bond has, we're only counting James Bond kills, as we mentioned before. So this is 21 kills. And Andy, as we've covered this before in the previous episode, Thunderball was 20. Now, I did, as listeners know, we're watching these each week and we're reviewing them now. I didn't watch another film, Andy, but I did do a little sneak peek in the future. And because I was thinking, we're not monitoring this, but obviously we know all these are Sean Connery kills. I was thinking, should we do a kill count per Bond actor? How many does, say, Sean Connery kill as James Bond? I know, obviously, it won't be fair on George Lazenby and Timothy Dalton because they appeared in fewer films. But I wondered, is there a big discrepancy between kill counts between actors that appeared in? We could work out an average, can't we? But I don't. Is that something that you think is worth tracking going forward?
Who is the deadliest Bond?
Deadliest Bond, I like it.
Yeah.
We can kind of
get that trademarked.
Yeah. So martinis, obviously, we mentioned at the beginning, so we're tracking martinis. So we've had 5 films. So Martini is Drunk and Martini in Dr. No, Goldfinger, and You Only Live Twice. Which I'm a bit surprised, Andy, because we've had 5 films, and 2 of those films he hasn't had a martini. I thought that was a bit of a given, same with the James Bond quote. You know, I thought it was
a real staple of the series, but so far we've been proven wrong.
Yeah, so in terms of the iconic James Bond, his introduction. I said at the beginning, he doesn't say it in this film. So what we do usually is just time it. So we've had 5 films. He's only actually said it twice, Andy. In Dr. No, at 7 minutes 40 seconds, and in Goldfinger, 11 minutes 33 seconds. I personally think, as this series has got, the franchise has got more popular, I think we're going to start seeing it in more films. I think it's only at the beginning where it's not kind of setting the trend, so to speak. I think we're going to see it in a lot more of the other films later on.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think once it becomes sort of almost romanticized as a staple of the films, then it becomes how do you get this into the script every time? But we shall see.
Whereas this is the opposite way, I think. So the next bit is the hat watch that Andy mentioned. So we're tracking hat throws and wearing a hat. So as Andy mentioned at the beginning, he said hat throw is a yes, and wearing a hat. And that's actually at the beginning, isn't it, in terms of the just after the funeral where he's brought onto the submarine and he's in his full kit, Commander Naval uniform, and he throws his hat. I know I mentioned this before, but I am keen to see what movie it is where Bond stops wearing a hat, because obviously we tracked it. So in the first 5 films, he's wore a hat in every movie so far. 2 of those movies, he doesn't do the hat throw. So like we said in Goldfinger episode, Miss Moneypenny does it. And then in the previous episode, Andy mentioned this, where the hat stand is actually being placed near the entrance so he doesn't throw it. But like I said, I know, I'm sure I say this each episode, I'm intrigued to see when it is. Because from memory, I don't recall Roger Moore wearing hats. But maybe, because I haven't seen a Roger Moore film for years. Whereas Sean Connery, I do think, when I think back, oh yeah, he wore a hat. And same with the gun barrel scene. The opening sequence, with the gun barrel, you can see the silhouette with a hat. I'm trying to think, when does that stop as well?
Yeah, Roger Moore doesn't strike me as a hat guy.
No, I agree. Whereas if I was Bond, I would be wearing a hat. So Felix Leiter, again, we're tracking whether Felix appears in each movie. And Andy has mentioned this in a previous episode, the number of times that Felix appears, but also being played by different actors. So he's not appeared in You Only Live Twice. Now, Bond girl. So this is where we see some variation. So we've had 5 Bond films and we've had 20 Bond girls, Andy. So that's quite good going, isn't it? At the moment.
This league table's really starting to take shape now. Shall I go with my thoughts and feelings on this first? So in terms of the film itself, we've got 4 Bond girls. We've got Aki, we've got Kissy, we've got Ling, and we've got Helga. And I say them in that order because that's the order that I placed the four of them in terms of the film. So Aki was my favourite Bond girl in this film. I think she was not only very beautiful, but also very smart as well. And like you said, she outwitted Bond early on, and she's, there seemed to be a bit more substance to her. She wasn't just eye candy. She was actually quite a smart girl. So she topped the list in terms of this film for me. And in terms of the overall placings of the 5 so far, I've got her in 8th place out of 20, right underneath Paula Kaplan and right above Patricia Fearing, both from the film Thunderball. In 2nd place for the film, and then in 10th overall, I've got Kissy. So just below Patricia. Obviously Kissy plays the role of Bond's wife, always in a bikini. That's going to get bonus points, but is a really, a typical piece of eye candy in the sense of the word, that she is there just to look good. That is her role in the film, pretty much. Further down, we've got Ling, who we saw a brief appearance at the start of the film. I've got her down in 14th overall, below Dink and above Tilly Masterson, both from the Goldfinger film. And then in 18th out of 20th, and only Zora and Vida keep her off the bottom spot, is Helga Brandt, who I don't know, didn't really take to her as a Bond girl, but also not helped by that ridiculous scene that we spoke about earlier, where she just throws herself at Bond even though she's supposed to be keeping him captive, and the elaborate way she tries to kill him. That ruined her mystique for me somewhat. You've got a slightly different take on things. How have you ranked the ladies?
Yeah, so this is getting difficult, Andy, if I'm being honest. And I think in terms of the podcast listeners, it's definitely worthwhile checking out our website, because we've got the information on the website. So obviously previous episodes, we've listed them all, haven't we, Andy? But now we've got 20. It's a bit unrealistic to do the orders for both of us, because obviously then that's 40 people that we're kind of covering, 40 characters. So, I mean, you've got Aki in at number 8 and you're number 1 from this film. I've done the same, but I've actually put her in at number 7. So just under Jill Masterson, who's obviously the golden lady from Goldfinger. And then I put in Kissy Suzuki at number 8, whereas you put her in at number 10. So in terms of the order, between both our Bond girls, there is the same. We've just got some slight differences in terms of how they kind of slot into the league table. We do have difference though with Helga. So I actually put Helga in 3rd place in terms of You Only Live Twice Bond girls, but overall in terms of 14th. I don't think, like, what you just said. I think as a Bond girl character, I think she's quite weak because of the things that we mentioned in the earlier episode, but she's higher than Ling just because she has more screen time. Lynn has that intro bit at the beginning, and then you don't see her anymore. So Helga's gone in at 14, so just below Tilly Masterson, and just above Vida from Russia We Love. And Ling has gone in at 17, so just below Zora from Russia We Love, and just above Mademoiselle Laporte from Thunderball. So, Andy, do you want to just kind of do you want to do the theme song and the opening credits, or kick us off?
Yeah. So the theme song, obviously, You Only Live Twice by Nancy Sinatra. I thought that was a really strong song. I've got this in at 2nd, just below Goldfinger by Shirley Bassey, which remains the kind of the gold standard, if you excuse the pun. But a strong effort, number 2 in terms of songs for me.
Yeah, and Andy, I changed this because when I originally pulled this together after I watched the film, and I think I mentioned this on last week's episode, I've been listening to a lot of the James Bond songs when I'm kind of typing up notes, but also kind of just in the background anyway. And for listeners, Andy's actually pulled together a Spotify playlist for anyone that kind of wants to kind of listen and listen to the playlist. So what we can do, Andy, when we release this episode, we can put a link online and share that if that's okay with you. So I've actually put You Only Live Twice number 2. It was very close between that and Thunderball, if I'm honest. I was oohing and ahhing between second place and third place. I thought, yeah, like you said, Goldfinger, Shirley Bassey is out there at number 1. And then I've got Dr. No in terms of the James Bond theme by Monty Norman, John Barry as number 4. So I did. It was very close. It was nowhere near as good as Goldfinger, and it was very close between Thunderball and You Only Live Twice. But it's a very good entry in terms of the Bond theme song series.
Yeah, I'd agree. However, from a credits perspective, I was a little bit disappointed with the opening credit sequence. I think before this week, I'd gone with the trend that each one was better than the last. So I've currently got Thunderball in my number 1 slot in terms of the credits, but I've got You Only Live Twice down at number 4 out of 5. Obviously, we've got like we talked about, we've got the volcanoes and we've got the silhouettes of the ladies, but it seemed somewhat haphazard to me and not very well thought out. I thought just not as inventive as what we saw from Thunderball or Goldfinger.
Yeah, so I agree. I'm just looking at the list, Andy, because we have got a bit of variation, haven't we, between what we've got. So you put You Only Live Twice in at number 4, whereas I've done it in at number 3 because I felt it was better than From Russia with Love, which you've got in 3rd place, opposed to where I've got it in 4th place. So these 2 movies have switched around between our list. The thing that swung it for me was From Russia with Love was the first Bond movie to include those kind of iconic, sexy ladies, silhouettes, dancing in the intro sequence. And we've seen the same now in each of the other movies. Whereas this one for me, there does seem to be more of. But I liked how this is obviously set in Japan, and I liked how then that influence was kind of seeping into the opening credits. So I quite enjoyed that. And obviously we discussed this in previous episodes, but I've got Goldfinger's number 1 and Thunderball's number 2, whereas you've got Thunderball as number 1 and Goldfinger number 2. So, Andy, next one is villains. Do you want to just go for your villains?
Villains, yeah. So technically 3 villains in this. We've got Blofeld again. We've got Helga, who's a Bond girl and a Bond villain. So the first time we've got crossover on the list. And we've got Mr. Osato. Across the franchise, we've got 11 villains overall. We've got Blofeld appearing multiple times, which we explained. We're talking about the instance of the villain in the film, not necessarily the overarching character across multiple films. So in this instance, I've got Blofeld from this film as 3 in total, and the highest position of any of the Blofeld characters that we've seen so far. So I've got Goldfinger and Oddjob in at 1 and 2, but Blofeld in this really stood out and kind of upped his game for me. I think last time out I said in Thunderball that he was largely irrelevant, whereas this time around he was very pivotal to what was going on, so a very strong outing. I've got Helga in 2nd in the film and 6th in total. What she lacked in being a Bond girl, she made up for in being a villain, and obviously being one of the associates of Spectre gave her that power as well. It was just some of it was let down by her silliness in wanting to have sex with the man she was supposed to be wanting to kill. But as a villain, some strong scenes. And then finally, Mr. Osato, I've got him as dead last. Seemed somewhat useless, in all honesty. But although, he led his own firm and he's an associate of Spectre, didn't really seem to have control at any point and was actually quite weak in terms of villainous traits.
Yeah, we've got some big variation between our list on this one. I'm just looking, Andy, and I'd love to know in terms of people that are either rewatching the films alongside what we're doing, or just listening and have that depth of knowledge in terms of Bond villains. So I've actually put in, only slightly different, Blofeld in from You Only Live Twice in at number 2. So Red Grant, I've mentioned him before. I really like that character. He's actually moved down now to 3rd place. So Goldfinger remains number 1 on both our list. I've actually put Mr. Osata and Helga in 10th and 11th. So they are at the bottom of my table. I just felt, we obviously said this last week, Thunderball character, villains were weak. I personally thought the only one that came out of this one with kind of any kind of credit, and I think it's the anticipation of the last 4 films, 5th film counting this one, where Blofeld kind of saved it from a villain point of view. You've obviously mentioned about how useless Helga was in terms of a villain, and Mr. Sata, apart from his office, his X-ray equipment, when he's looking at Bond through his table with his gun, and he made some comments about what did he say about him not being feeling safe or something, but he was talking about the cigarette, but obviously he's talking about the gun. Do you remember that bit? Yeah. So but we got some variation there. So I would be intrigued to see what other people think about that. I think, because looking at your list, obviously Odd Job is number 2. I've got him at number 4. I think, there's not much difference there. He's quite an iconic character, isn't he? A villain, Odd Job. But he's a
henchman. He's a henchman, but he's very strong. He's very powerful, very menacing. So I think that for me gets him so high up the list. Yeah,
whereas these last 2 films, apart from, like I said, Blofeld, they have been a bit weaker, haven't they? I think, in terms of, earlier on. So Andy, if I just pick up the movies now, we've obviously given our score earlier, so when we both gave it 6 out of 10. I thought this was interesting. So just to recap my ones, Andy, before you do yours, I've got Goldfinger at number 1 as 9 out of 10. From Russia with Love, 8 out of 10. Then Thunderball 3rd, but with 7 out of 10, and then Dr. No 7 out of 10 at 4th position. So this is, in terms of my scoring, is the weakest one, so it goes in at number 5. Andy, you've obviously given your score earlier, but what how does that change the ranking?
So I've got the same ranking as you in terms of 1 to 5. Goldfinger is a clear front runner for me, but I've been a bit stingier on the marks for From Russia with Love, Thunderball, and Dr. No. I've gone 7, 6, 6 for those, and I've also gone 6 for You Only Live Twice. I felt it was on par with Thunderball and Dr. No, but the reason I've got this in at 5th, as opposed to joint, you could argue joint 3rd, but I'm trying to differentiate between the films. This is the one, the one time I felt disappointed with a film. It felt flat to me. It felt, the funny lines were not quite as funny. Some of the action scenes were not quite as good. It just felt like it was lacking something. Maybe with Connery announcing that this was his last one, he was, dare I say, phoning it in a little bit. That'd be possibly an unfair thing to say. Some of the use of special effects and green screen and stuff left me a bit disappointed, and some of the ridiculousness in like the plot holes and things we've discussed just left me feeling a little bit deflated when I was watching this. So it's the worst one we've seen so far, but still solid overall. Just with the level we've seen up to now, this one just fell a bit short for me.
Yes, brilliant. And then in terms of people looking at the website, what we're doing as well, Andy, is we're ranking them within the films that they've done. So obviously we've only done Sean Connery at the moment. He's done 6 films. We've done the first 5, so it's just the same as what we've just gone through at the moment. And then what we are also going to do is rank the actors. So at the moment we've only had Sean Connery, so he's number 1 in both our list. Did we? I'm sure we've covered this, but I can't remember if we went into any great detail, Andy. So what we've done is we've made a list in terms of the actors, where we think in terms of 1 to 6, who is our favorite, who's our least favorite. So, 1 to 6 before we started rewatching these films. And then we're going to compare that list against the list that we've done after rewatching these films. I remember definitely doing the top 2. Do you remember, or shall we just basically just leave that for now? Because I remember doing the top 2, but I can't remember if we did any more.
I'm not sure if we did worst or not, but we may have just done top 2. Shall we just let this boil over for a few more weeks, just to make sure we're not influencing our own decision? But as things stand, I still feel quite confident with that ranking I've got in place. I think once we get into next week, obviously we've got Lazenby and his solo outing on Her Majesty's Secret Service, and I wonder if the fact that he only managed 1, does that count for him or against him? Ultimately, when we think of Sean Connery, he's had 6 chances to get it right. Lazenby was a one and done. So I wonder how that affects his legacy, or also how it affects our thinking of his legacy, whether it's fair or unfair to judge him based on 1 performance alone. So come next week, it'll be interesting to see what our thoughts are on Lazenby.
Yeah, and I think next week's episode might be a bit longer than this week's episode because he's a new actor. So it's the first time we've had to cover the transition from one actor to another. So we can spend a bit of time on that. From memory, I know we're doing the rankings after we rewatch them, but On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a film that I remember being good and was one of my favorites from, when I first watched the film. So I am looking forward to watching the film in preparation for next week's episode. So I'm looking forward to that. Is there anything else, Andy, before we kind of sign off?
No, I think that's the end of an era, at least for now, because it's bye Sean Connery, hello George Lazenby. So let's see how he fares. I'm looking forward to this one. This is probably the one I'm most looking forward to watching, even though it's probably the one I remember the least.
Yes, and we can obviously cover it next week. I remember the theme song. That is, something that stands out, and various things which we can discuss next week. But yeah, so thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Well, that's this week's episode done. We hope you enjoyed it.
Special thanks to the band Sugar Tongue for the theme tune to The Rating Room. You can find them on all the usual social media channels, and be sure to check out their song The System, available now on Spotify.
You can find and message us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram by searching The Rating Room.
You'll find all our social media links on our website, theratingroom.com, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Or feel free to drop us an email at theratingroom@gmail.com. Goodbye, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week, right here on The Rating Room.